Hi, I'm Paul Moss, and I'm pleased to today have the opportunity and honor to introduce Dr. Giovanni Allo, who is going to be our speaker for the next 30 minutes. Dr. Allo is an author, educator, and curator specializing in the representation of nature and the environment in art. Allo is editor-in-chief of Antennae, the Journal of Nature and Visual Culture. He is also the author of many books on art and nature, including Art and Animals, Speculative Taxonomy, Why Look at Plants, The Botanical Emergence in Contemporary Art, Botanical Speculations, Animal, Exploring the Zoological World, and Lucian Freud Herbarium. He's a regular public speaker at the Art Institute of Chicago, a radio contributor, and has curated exhibitions in the USA and abroad. Allo also lectures on modern and contemporary art at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago and Sotheby's Institute of Art in New York. Dr. Allo will be speaking today on Phytopoetics, Domestic Biosemiotics Against Plant Objectification and Capitalism. With that, I'd like to welcome Dr. Allo to this talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Paul, and thanks to the organizer for doing such a great job putting together this amazing event. It's a great pleasure to be here today, and I want to talk to you about phytopoetics, domestic biosemiotics against plant objectification and capitalism. And it seems appropriate to begin with an image of my potted companions that spend a considerable amount of time around the house and downstairs in the basement during the winter months and come out to play between May and October. We spend a lot of time together. Why look at potted plants? This is a big question today. Well, there are a number of reasons why, according to me, this is a good idea. First of all, because they have been overlooked by Western philosophy. Because the pot itself can become a productive opportunity to individualize plants in original ways. The pot as an object, I think, is an ubiquitous troubler of nature and culture. Some might see it as a symbol of care, but others might actually think that it's plant abuse. So we know that Western philosophy has marginalized the non-human for thousands of years now, at least a couple. And the ontological turn in the humanities was all about foregrounding the non-human in our thinking and in our making. The anthropocentrism that pervades Western philosophy has, in a sense, been driven by this desire and necessity that Western philosophy has to generalize. It's part of a linguistic issue similar to the singular plural animal, which Derrida objected to. There's an impossibility of language to contain the diversity of the non-human, and a totalization that it's operated every time we use the words animal and plant that becomes conceptual, not just formal. And universalization. If Western philosophy cannot abstract and universalize, then what's the point? And of course, with that comes a problem of exclusionism. There has been extensive talk over the past 50 years about the exclusionism of the point of view of philosophy from a racial and gender perspective, and that also applies to the species of plants, in this case, to which Western philosophy has been blind, like, for instance, carnivorous species, cacti, epiphytes. Their behavior and morphology just doesn't fit the mold of what philosophy has called a plant, and so they are ignored. You will remember as well that Deleuze and Guattari's rhizome became all the rage a few years ago because he proposed an alternative to the notion of tree that had become the quintessential entity of plant in Western culture. But that raises a question about why stopping at these two models, when we know that the plant kingdom offers so many other models that we could use to think differently about ourselves. And of course, the underlying problem with purity that I'm going to return to in this talk. I'm moving quite fast because there is a lot of material to cover. These ideas can be seen in the poster boy of conceptual art, the 1 and 3 chairs work by Joseph Kossuth, in which he used an object, the chair, the photograph of the object, and the vocabulary definition of chair juxtapose. What is this work about? Well, we can argue that it's a question about ontology, phenomenology, and semiotics. We can argue that it has its roots firmly grounded in structuralism, and that it's a work that in many interesting ways evidences the inadequacy of language to differentiate concepts in ways that do justice to the materiality of media. So Kossuth allowed curators around the world to stage this work using different models of chairs, different designs. And you can see here again, the vocabulary definition also changes. And to prove the universalization of the idea of the underlying concept, he also replaced the object with a hammer, which to some of you might remind of Heidegger, and a shovel, which might remind us of Duchamp, and then a plant. So 1 and 3 plants, which is the vegetal iteration of Kossuth's work, I argue trips that concept. The underlying concept that Kossuth explores throughout man-made objects cannot be transferred seamlessly to the potted plant for a number of reasons. First of all, the potted plant is a living being. It grows, it's not static, and the identity of the plant goes well beyond it being a plant. The species of membership defines this plant, or let's say should define our understanding of this living being beyond the label of plant. And if you also read the label, you will see some disconcerting statements about the lack of sentience and the inability to move intentionally in this dated now labels. And of course, curators are free to stage the work with whichever species of plant they like. They favor cacti because it's the one they can keep alive more easily in the gallery space, but others have looked at other options involving houseplants, which also survive in enclosed spaces. So the potted plant is a problem, culturally speaking. Too close to the domestic sphere to represent a universal truth, and yet so close to us that we begin to ignore it. So what is the problem between potted plants and universalization? Well, there are many issues at stake, but there's an interesting example I want to bring forward now, which comes from Michael Marder's Philosopher's Plant. Michael Marder was sensitive to the problem of philosophical generalization. So in the book, he focuses on instances in which philosophers have talked about a specific plant species. In one passage, he focuses on the Islamic book of cleanness or tahara. And the ground is intrinsically linked to God's creation and therefore possesses purifying qualities that only man can tamper with. The text talks about crops that are deteriorated or tainted by the mismanagement of humans, and the use of pots comes to the fore. The Book of Cleanness validates the idea that if a plant pot as a whole, big enough for a small root to come out through it, it counts as the ground, and what is planted is not susceptible to uncleanness. I think this is really interesting because, in a sense, it reassesses what becomes in Western philosophy this unease with the potted plant because it simply isn't enough of its own thing. It evidences the issue with the lack of naturalness. In a sense, the potted plant is not as natural as a tree planted in the ground. You can extend this idea of cleanness to an idea of originality and purity in thinking. The artists, as we know, are often, especially contemporary artists, very disrespectful of ideas of purity and cleanness. So they have tampered with potted plants and thought about them more creatively already. The big argument here is that recovering the potted plant in our new modes of being with the vegetal world constitutes an important step towards a recovery of the knowledge that is produced elsewhere in the realm of biosemiotics, within a phenomenology of the domestic that ultimately holds the key to the development of empathy with vegetal beings. An empathy that is essential to the grounding of care for vegetal bodies that exist beyond our reach and that are central to life on this planet. So, in this work by Michelangelo Pistoletto from 1965, the artist has applied screen printing over polished stainless steel plates that reflect the viewer like a mirror, as we can see here. The trick is easy. The plant will always be in the foreground, never in the background as it used to be in classical philosophy. It's a reversal of hierarchies which sometimes puzzles the viewer and works as a metaphorical upset of the tradition, the expectation of anthropocentrism. The paintings of Lucian Freud from the 1950s and beyond also operate a similar economy and subversion of human-plant hierarchies, like we see here in the case of this yucca that occupies the foreground once again and seem to be confronting the male figure. Lucian Freud, from the 50s onwards, paints the plants he lived with for years. Plants which therefore present highly idiosyncratic features, as we can see here, often due to lack of conventional care, irregular watering, and poor lighting conditions. These are the human-plant contingencies that ultimately shape the body of plants in identities that are shared between us, them, and the spaces they live in. And I'm going to talk about this further through this talk. Another outstanding painting in which Lucian Freud foregrounds the plant, as we can see here in this case, a variegated pandanus. The artist appears behind the beautiful leaves, cupping his ear, appearing to be listening to something, as the title of the painting suggests. Could he have been listening to the plant? Was he trying to understand something more of this silent relationship in which he finds himself caught, constantly observing and being confronted by these domestic companions that share the space with him? And of course, the work of Rashid Johnson, African-American artist who negotiates his identity through installations in which plants play important roles. In the context of his art, there is an invitation to prioritize the institution and affinity as valid modes of experience capable of surpassing social class boundaries, national and racial identity constructs. In this context, the living plants, are used in two specific ways. They destabilize the power systems of the institution as inscribed in the purity of the gallery space, and they introduce an element of responsibility. As the artist explained, plants are a call to be present, to keep something alive, to observe, and to ultimately care. I can't stress enough how, in both cases, in Lucian Freud and Rashid Johnson, although the works of art are very different, observation and being present are essential modes of being with. And lastly, I wanted to foreground Estado Vegetal, the performance by Manuela Infante, acted and co-written by Marcela Salinas, which I cannot recommend more. a theater piece that's been winning awards around the world, that's entirely dedicated to plants and the philosophy of Michael Marder and the research of Stefano Mancuso, among many others. In a sequence which focuses on potted plants, an elderly lady is persuaded by one plant, who speaks to her, to free it from its pot. From the plant's perspective, the pot is a brutal imposition that betrays the sessile nature of plants. The plant then persuades her to lift the floorboards, to relocate all plants in the ground beneath the house. At the end of the sequence, the woman is found dead, standing among the plants with her legs planted into the ground. Nearby is a massive pile of empty pots. And before I focus more specifically on speculative phytopoetics and explain what I mean by this term, I also wanted to briefly remind us all about the complications raised by our desire to communicate with plants. I'm sure many of you will remember this iconic book, The Secret Life of Plants, which in 1973 caused a massive stir and in a way has kind of given human-plant communication a bit of a bad name. The book was turned into a wonderful film with a music score by Stevie Wonder. The film is called The Secret Life of Plants, and I certainly recommend it. It's extremely entertaining. There is something beautiful about The Secret Life of Plants and the burning desire to communicate with our vegetal beings. However, it's also tapped into a kind of new age approach and attitude that have not blended well with Western philosophy. So that's not to discount the knowledge produced by The Secret Life of Plants. However, I feel that we need to rewire this knowledge in order to make it useful to today. I was visiting home in Milan in 2019 when I stumbled across this old secondhand book from 1983 by Valerio Sanfo. The title immediately caught my attention. How to Communicate with Plants. Plants speak, hear, and suffer. And then the title continues, the latest scientific evidence about their language, their sensitivity, and their cognition. Pretty impressive stuff. Well, it didn't take long for the book to turn out exactly what I thought it would be. It's, not very grounded in scientific research at all. But however, I came across this phrase that resounded with me, the frequenza mentale, a mental frequency, which I think has some productivity embedded in it. There's something important about the idea that ultimately, if plants can speak to us, they can't tell us anything, and we can't really access their language in the human terms. There is no acoustic, verbal communication. Then attuning ourselves with this frequency is what speculative phytopoetics is about. And it's not quite linked to spirituality. You might be surprised if I say that actually it's linked directly to keeping your plant happy, healthy, or even just surviving. It's about that dependency. The potted plant is entirely dependent on us. So if the plant is alive, along the way, I argue, we are engaging with some kind of speculative phytopoetics. So what are speculative phytopoetics? They are a subsection of what in my work I call vegetal attunements. Attunements are a personal step towards vegetal empathy that enable us to reclaim plants from the epistemological myopia of Western philosophy, science, and capitalism. How does it work? You're probably already practicing some kind of phytopoetics with your regular houseplant care. But I see speculative phytopoetics as an opportunity to individualize your plant beyond the strictures of anthropomorphism, an opportunity to align our perception of our plant companion that has been sharing space and time with us. Is anyone familiar with the moment a plant begins to look poorly? Don't you wish your plant could speak and tell you what it's wrong? Of course, we've all been there. But since it can't, we begin to look for reliable and official information that might save its life, like in the case of this Facebook group. Don't get me wrong, this is in part more than fine. You need to know your basics, parasites, fungi, and so on. But capitalism has trained us to feel inadequate about our plant keeping, leading us always to believe that someone else, not us, an expert, always knows best. And I disagree with that. Another Facebook group, as you can see, the names, the titles of these groups tell you about the level of desperation we feel when the plant seems to be suffering. When it comes to houseplants, I argue that you might be the one who's better positioned to know what's best. Here's why. The capitalist scene is probably the one and only term I can get on when it comes to the alternative to the Anthropocene, because it foregrounds the reality of our material consumption and conceptual alignment with reality so well, especially when it comes to plants. This really funny cartoon tells it like it is. In the hands of capitalism, the pot has become a normativizing tool for efficient production. It does not individualize plants, it rationalizes them for easy and cost-effective transportation and consumption. Does capitalism care that our plants are going to be happy after they're sold to us? Well, no. Look at the tiny labels that come with each plant, which give us such generalized little bits of information. I mean, there's more information on the booklet that comes with an alarm clock than there is on the pot or in the pot of a plant. It's kind of like mind-boggling. So this cartoon shows us that plants you'll kill in 1 week, it's given for granted that they're gonna die, will cost $8, not that much. Plants you'll kill in 3 weeks, a little bit more, and of course, those that you can keep alive for 2 months cost a little more. But the assumption is that they're all going to die, and capitalism doesn't care, because of course the point of capitalism is to keep selling those plants. This is why I argue that the house plant you've kept alive in your home for 10 years or longer is a statement of defiance against capitalism. More coming soon in this talk. So this is what plants that come out of the gardening center tend to look like. Very bushy, very happy, and there's a reason why this is. Look at this hibiscus that looks kind of compact and tiny and yet carries far too many blooms. Well, plants often come from nurseries in which not only their needs have been perfectly met, but where they have been deliberately pumped up to a near unsustainable bio level. The nurseries in which plants are produced by the millions know one thing very well. Most species of domesticated plants like stability and regularity. In nurseries, plant lives are ruled by timers. Regular watering, consistent lighting conditions for the same exact amount of time every day, slightly warmer days and cooler nights, and reliable humidity levels, as well as good airflow, allow plants to grow bigger and stronger than they could ever do in any other natural environment. This works well for them because plants are keen planners. While they might not think in a centralized way, every part of their vegetal bodies responds to their surroundings in a knowing way. They constantly sense and evaluate the environment around them as they calculate their next move and ponder their risks. How many blooms can be supported is dictated by the knowledge the plant develops of how much water, light, and nutrients it can safely rely upon over an extended period of time. Overreaching can mean death. However, to problematize things further comes chlorm quat chloride. Did you ever know this existed? Those who work in the industry know this chemical very well. What is it? Well, let's say that the plant you have just bought from the gardening center or saved from the supermarket stand is actually on drugs. Literally. It has been regularly sprayed, injected, or watered with a growth retardant called chloromquat chloride. Formulated in the late 1950s by Dr. N.E. Tolbert, a chemistry professor at Michigan State University, chloromquat drastically inhibits stem elongation and promotes thickness, leaf greenness of chrysanthemums, poinsettias, and other species is accentuated by this chemical. This is why your new plant often looks sassy, compact, and brimming with life when it comes back home, because its natural growth processes have been compressed so to make it look fuller and richer, ready for purchase. These are anthropomorphic aesthetic qualities we associate with good health and prosperity, but which might not indicate the same in plants. Capitalism has miseducated us to recognize these aesthetic values as natural when they are artificially induced instead. This state of affairs greatly interferes with the development of speculative phytopoetics. When plants enter our homes, adjusting to our less than ideal habitat will inevitably be traumatic, and coming off the drugs will be a drag. The plants are like addicts gone cold turkey. So, no surprise, some leaves will turn yellow and drop. No surprise, the plant will begin to look stringy. We have all been fooled by chloromquat chloride, the plant included. Chloromquat interferes with speculative phytopoetics and casts us as the failure who will never be able to make that plant happy again, the way it looked when it came out of the store. Where do you find chloromquat chloride? On Etsy. This little bottle costs roughly $2. It's easy to find, and you can also find, of course, the industrial brands like Citadel. I just wanted to show you this informative brochure which uses some interesting language. Citadel increases crop quality and durability by producing more compact and marketable plants. This is the aim of chloromquat chloride. It's got nothing to do with the happiness or health of the plant. And these diagrams show you how chloromquat changes the morphology of the plant in a radical way. Look at the baby primrose fragrant lowland left in its natural selective form, only being given water, and on the right with the maximum amount of chloromquat in it. It looks like a different plant, and you can see how this is easier to transport and easier to the eye as well. And over here, again, another example with a different variety. They look like different plants. Once the chloromquat chloride is no longer applied, the plant will return to its natural form, which means that it will look very, very different from what you've purchased. I believe this also poses some interesting ethical questions about what we are being sold in gardening centers. So speculative phytopoetics, what are they? Well, speculative phytopoetics are languages. They're not something we decipher in the sense that we learn to decode what the plant is saying, but they are something we craft in our intraactive way, since much of what our plant does is a response to the space it lives in and our actions toward it. Crafting phytopoetics requires proximity, regularity, patience, presence, and determination. They comprise sets of non-verbal, non-written communicational codes we developed with individual plants. They are a subcategory of biosemiotics, the field concerned with prelinguistic meaning-making, production, and interpretation of codes in living systems. Speculative phytopoetics are specific to one plant and are subject to change if the plant is moved to a different room in your home or to a balcony. The set of codes that make up phytopoetics are often non-transferable to other plants of the same species. They therefore represent the perceptible framework of the plant identity, an identity which is dispersed across the geography of the domestic space they share with us. In other words, they are this one-on-one set of bridges we build as we try to understand how a plant can be kept alive in our domestic environment. There's something fascinating about this process because, of course, it entails trial and error. And that's where the being present and the being keen and observing begins to play a role that I also find is linked to artistic production and artistic consumption. The being present that painting, like the paintings of Lucian Freud, instilled in us, the call for attention that they bring forward is, in a sense, aching to the work you put in crafting speculative phytopoetics with your plants. Speculative phytopoetics makes us acutely aware that plant identity is a composite of many factors. A houseplant is defined by its environment, the humidity in the air, the heating system, the light, the pot it grows in. Is it made of plastic? Is it made of terracotta? The soil. All these factors make up the identity of the plant. Nobody else out there who wrote a book or is on a Facebook group can know. People will advise and you will find potential remedies to what you think your plant is suffering. However, there will always be an element that belongs to the domestic sphere that nobody else can know and that you have to identify. Each plant, even from the same species, is different because of the pot or soil it grows in, or simply because it cannot occupy exactly the same spot taken by another plant of the same species in your home. The angle of the light will be different. There are many varieties in one species too, and they all behave somewhat differently. So phytopoetics are a matter of nuances. That's how they draw us into a state of deep observation. A deep observation that it's not geared towards creating the perfect marketable plant, but a keen observation that is devoted to keeping the plant alive in a space the plant doesn't necessarily belong. We can further bolster the idea of speculative phytopoetics with two Japanese Zen philosophies, one wabi-sabi and the other one Kinzuchi. They both provide important perspectives in which to harness our phytopoetics and counter capitalist power in human-vegetal relations. Wabi-sabi nurtures all that is authentic and by acknowledging three simple realities: nothing lasts, nothing is finished, and nothing is perfect. It's a philosophy of acceptance, and it teaches us to appreciate the struggliness and often non-symmetrical structure of our houseplants, for their look is the result of their cohabitation with us in our homes. That is a mark of originality and individuality that's irreplaceable. Capitalism cannot erase that, and capitalism cannot fabricate that. It's not like a pair of worn out jeans with a rip on the knee that you can buy anywhere today. In the shape of their branches is written our shared history, their identity enmeshed with ours and the spaces we have shared over time. There's a really interesting store in Los Angeles called the Cactus Store, which is run by Carlos and John Moreira, and later joined by Jeff Kaplan, Max Martin, and Christian Cummings, who puts this philosophy at the core of their activity. Their collection of cacti uh, is amazing because they're all individuals and they all wear their scars with pride. You probably have noticed that when you buy cacti in gardening centers, they tend to be pristine. That's because the ones that have been scarred by whatever accident or event are chucked out before they reach the store or upon reaching the store. That's how capitalism operates, as you know. But the store, the cactus store, follows this wabi-sabi philosophy, according to which the scar on a cactus, which is often indelible, is something to celebrate. It's part of the uniqueness of the plant. And there's a Korean artist called Lee Kwang-ho who's actually painted cacti, taking care of never erasing the marks of individuality and identity that make them so special, that which capitalism despises. And I also wanted to bring my own contribution. This is a cactus that comes from a fragment I found in Los Angeles on the sidewalk while having a lovely time with a couple of friends of mine. We were taking this beautiful walk in this neighborhood. And as we walked, we saw this broken cactus on the ground. And the broken part is the one we see at the very base. It originally was the segment here, the narrower segment, and this scar was there. It had been probably caused by the fall from the top of this cactus that grew on the sidewalk. And to me, that scar is everything. Whenever I looked at this cactus, which as you can see now, 2.5 years later, has grown to a height of 3 feet and it's not planning to stop, still bears the very memory of that encounter. That encounter that also included the conversations and the looking that my friends and I did that morning. We kept looking at all these plants. It was actually difficult to keep our conversations focused on anything because we kept being distracted by these beautiful plants on the sidewalk. So that's how a plant becomes special and irreplaceable, individualized by its pot and at the same time by the markers of life that have made it irreplaceable. And the other philosophy, as I mentioned earlier, it's Kinzuchi. Kinzuchi invites us not to be ashamed of what is damaged or broken, but to celebrate the scar as a sign that life has occurred. Plants in gardening centers, supermarkets, or big spot chain store must look perfect and unblemished, otherwise they get thrown out. While nobody would want to buy a diseased plant, we have all been trained to get the best deal for our money. Capitalism has miseducated us to reject what looks less than perfect, since the only relationship it contemplates between buyer and commodity is the commercial transaction. Leveraging decades of consumer miseducation perpetrated in the vegetable aisles of supermarkets, where only the most perfect apple is ever worth purchasing, capitalism applies the same consumerist philosophy to living plants, imposing on them hardly sustainable aesthetic standards and simply discards the rest. There's an artwork by Yi Suk-yong that shows us how Kinzuchi can be manifested by repairing with gold. So the crack is celebrated as a sign of pride, of history, of having lived, instead of being seen as a defect or as something to be ashamed of, or even worse, something that compromises the purity and integrity of the object in this case, or we could say the living being. So there's plenty to learn from these philosophies in the context of speculative phytopoetics. And I wanted to return, to wrap up my talk, to this beautiful painting by Lucian Freud, just to say that the speculative quality of the phytopoetics I am theorizing is referencing speculative realism in the sense that, of course, we can never really know, we can never really make sure that what we see is what really is happening. We can never make sure that the blurring of boundaries and that prodding of boundaries ultimately rings true to the non-human at the other end. And by rings true, I mean is aligned with our intention. The key is always anthropocentrism. It's impossible for us to snap out of it 100%. It's a matter of attuning ourselves to the non-human. And there is something important about developing this intimacy with our domestic companions that speculative phytopoetics invites. Being able to detect a change in the intensity of green on the leaves, the angle at which they appear at a certain time of the day. I wanted to wrap up my talk by returning to this gorgeous painting by Lucian Freud and this idea of listening, which art historians have always bypassed. The few who have dared to comment on this painting have actually assumed that Lucian Freud is trying to listen to another human on the other side of the plant, which we cannot see in the canvas, because they were so afraid to even contemplate the idea that he could be trying to listen to the plant. There's something fascinating about speculative phytopoetics and the way in which they are impossible to write. So much of these codes are subliminal as well as almost imperceptible, that language constantly fails to describe them accurately. That's why they can't be passed on either. I see speculative phytopoetics as this end of the line in human non-human communication. It's really that intimate that it can't be passed on as advice, and it only exists in that special place of kinship that it's been developed over time with your domestic companion. And that's why I think we should look at potted plants a lot more carefully. Thank you very much.